ahead and get started here today. I want to thank you all that are joining us right now for the live stream of our University of Idaho Beef Cattle webinar series for another installment. And for those of you who are watching the recording later, thanks for checking out our offerings. I also want to welcome and thank Shannon Williams for joining us today. Shannon's going to be presenting on record keeping. Shannon is the University of Idaho Extension educator up in Lemhi County, who is responsible for livestock programming up in that part of the state. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over now to Shannon and give her the floor. Thanks, Shannon.
Hey, thank you, Miranda. Excited to be here and visit with you about record keeping. I'm the state co-coordinator for the Beef Quality Assurance Program, and my soapbox is very much about record keeping. And so we'll get started. Feel free to put questions in the chat box. We've got a couple of polls that we'll do, and hopefully this information will meet your needs. So we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so really the proof is in the records, and we're going to talk about some ideas about effective record keeping and some things that you may want to track as you look at keeping records of your beef operation. What we're going to cover today, we're going to talk a little bit about why keeping some records, why you keep your records, what's your goals for that, specific records to keep, and then talk about methods to keep records. So why do you keep some records? One of the main reasons that you'll want to consider about keeping some records is hopefully you have some written goals of your operation. And to know if you've reached those goals, you need to keep records to say, yes, we did. If you're working on trying to increase the weights of your calves as you wean them in the fall, if you don't have records from last year to know what they weighed, you will not know if you've surpassed that. While we all have steel trap memories, sometimes that's not the best way to keep the records. Some records are required by law, and we'll talk about that some more. You want to identify those areas of improvement. If you're having a lot of dystocia, you may want to, and recorded that when you look back at those calving records and you're having to pull a lot of calves, or one cow is continually having problems. If those records are written down, you may want to go back and look at those and identify them, analyze them, and see what you can do for improvement. And then really your records can be a planning tool to improve or make next year's plan. Did our treatment records show that what we use for pink eye or for foot rot really work? Or do we need to go talk with our vet and have a new plan for this next year, or maybe try some new drugs to treat with? So those are some good reasons that you'll want to keep records. So why do you keep records? A lot of producers, as I've talked, they want to identify those top producing animals, which cows are weaning the heaviest calves or percentage of their body weight, which cows are breeding back on a regular basis. Are they cycling thing? Are they getting older? So are they on track for production? You know, are the bulls taking and getting the job done in a timely manner, or do I need to take a look at my bulls? You'll want to keep a record of your vaccinations. That's important by law, and as you sell cattle, as you move cattle, as cattle mix on the mountain, make sure everything is what vaccination's been given. Records of treatments are extremely important. There are many new drugs out on the market, and so if you're treating foot rot or pink eye or whatever your operation is dealing with, are your treatments really working, or is it time to take a look at what that treatment protocol's been and work with your vet to update it? Withdrawal times, those are one of those records that are required by law. If you treat an animal and you read the label completely through on what you're treating it with, you need to make sure that you do not sell that animal before that withdrawal time is up for that product. Whether it's 30 days, 60 days, 25 days, that needs to be recorded so that you hold on to that animal for that full time. Feed records, we'll talk some more about feed records of what you're feeding, how you're feeding, pasture movement, and then feed production. So as we talked about goals, you really need records to determine if you're reaching the goals. So hopefully each of you have goals for your operation, and they are SMART goals, meaning they're specific, not just, I want my cows to get better, I want my cows to do better. That's not very specific. They're measurable, so you know if you've reached that goal. I want to increase ribeye area. I want to decrease back fat by a specific measurement. I want to calve everybody, have all my cows calve within 60 days. They need to be attainable, but they need you to challenge it. Don't say, well, I hit 60 days last year, so I'm going to shoot for 59. Or make it attainable but challenging. They need to be reachable so you can achieve them, and you need to be able to track those goals. Also, what I didn't add on here is there's usually a cost to attain each of those goals, whether it's the cost of the proper bull, if it's the cost of the new fence. There's usually a dollar value attached to each of those goals. You'll want to track and record data that tells you if you've reached your goals. I had the experience several years ago when we were beginning some of the first demonstration projects with EIDs and working with a large ranch here and putting lots of information in the computer after we read their tags with the reader. And we had rows and columns of data. And I was working with the ranch manager's wife, and we had gorgeous Excel spreadsheets. They were a work of art. If you just ask us, we would tell you. And as Mike looked at all that data, he says, why'd you girls record that? We went, because we could. It was cool. We thought it might be fun. And we had a whole lot of data that was never utilized. And basically it cluttered up our spreadsheet. And so record the data that's important, that tells you if you reached your goals, that's necessary. Don't record data just because you can, but remember the data you collect will be different for your operation versus the neighbors. One of the things that we did track for this particular ranch, their buyer at the time would not buy calves that had a pink nose. So we had a column on there for the color nose of each calf because that was important to them. And so, yes, if you're not utilizing the information that you're tracking, spend your time's better spent someplace else, or don't track it. So really make sure that the data you're tracking and keeping records of will be utilized and ties back into your goals so you answer the questions that you want. So Miranda, can you fire the poll? Or maybe I can poll here. There we go. So I missed my first question, but if anybody in the audience would, you can click, and if you, okay, it's ending polling. This is new for me. If you have written goals, cool. That is really neat. 67% of you say that you have written goals. Very, very nice. And we can share those results for everybody. And as you can see, that 67% said yes and 33% no. So those of you that do not have written goals, I encourage you to do that. So, okay, now to go to my next slide. There we go. So as I mentioned earlier, one reason you'll want to keep records is part of records, some of the records are required by law. And I'm here to tell you that those records, especially treatment records and withdrawal times, are your only defense if you are ever contacted because there's a residue of treatment antibiotics in beef from a processing plant that was owned by you. The only way you can say, no, that can't be me, here's the records of when that animal was treated, when the withdrawal time was met before it went to the processing house. And those have to be written. Good records of treatment and withdrawal times also demonstrates responsible use of antimicrobial products, and chemical application records are also records that are required by law. So for those Idaho producers that are online, please, please, please keep good records. Pay attention to your withdrawal times. This is part of an email that, as a BQA coordinator for the state, I get occasionally. And this is from National BQA saying, we have a repeat violator in the state of Idaho that has residue in their carcasses. And then it becomes Scott and I's job to talk to this person and say, you need to step it up. You need to pay attention to withdrawal times. And so I cringe when I get these type of emails, because I would hope that Idaho producers would read the label and follow the guidelines when it comes to paying attention to withdrawal times, so there are not residues in their carcasses. So as we talk about records to keep, production records are always a big thing and probably one of the easiest ones to do. Calving records are very useful as you look through and say, okay, cow 601 is slowly getting later every year. So maybe I need to take a look at her and see if she needs to be culled, or what I can do to get her back on a regular cycle. How many calves did we have to pull? Did we have trouble with scours? Did the bulls get their job done? You can learn a lot of information from those calving records. Weaning weights, that allows you to help you calculate how many pounds of beef per acre of ranch, per acre of ground did you have? Are our weaning weights where we want them to be? Are they down this year? And then are up. If they're up, you can look and say, okay, we had a good production year. The rains came at the right time. Or if your weaning weights are down, do we follow that rabbit trail and try to figure out, was it a feed issue? Was there a sickness issue? Go through. Recording those can give you some good information. Culling records. This is one I hadn't really thought about until I was doing some more research on this, but it's a good idea to maybe look and say, why am I culling these cows? And are we culling them for the same reason all the time? Is it age? All of us age 1 year at a time, but if I'm culling them because of bad bags or bad feet, do I need to take a look at see what my genetics are producing, and can I fix that problem? You'll want to look at your pasture production, and we'll talk about some more about that a little bit, a couple slides down, and then our hay production. Vaccination records are a given. Your herd health records are very, very important. What diseases are you vaccinating for? And if you move to an area, a new area, you need to check with the vets there and say, what should we be vaccinating for? What you vaccinate for in Lemhi County may or may not be the same for North Idaho. And so you always want to check. Visit with your vet on a regular basis once a year and say, is there anything I need to change and update? You want to write down the product you utilized along with the lot and the serial number. That lot and serial number are very important. If you ever have a vaccine wreck, you can take that back to the company and they can track it back and see if it was a vaccine problem itself, or maybe it was an administration problem. Also, read your labels. Do you need to give a booster? When does that date need to happen? What's the route of administration? BQA really highly recommends, if you can at all possible, that it needs to be sub-Q, not IM, but you need to read the label. What does it recommend? And then what is the withdrawal time and the earliest date that that withdrawal time is met? Again, that comes back to following the law and reading your label, and so that if you do sell that animal, it's cleared of the residue. Treatment records, what animals are treated, and so you need some animal identification. What indicated treatment? As we are all producing beef for a consumer to eat. Not all consumers have an ag background or a beef background. So if they were to talk to you and you say that you're treating an animal, you want to be able to tell them more than it looked sick. Excuse me here for a minute. What did it, look sick look like? Were they running a fever? Were they droopy eared? Were their eyes running? Did they have a runny nose? What was the date of that treatment? What product did you use? Again, the lot and serial number. How much did you give them? If you have an extra label use, you need to have a copy of that from your veterinarian. Route of administration. Who administered it? Sometimes some operations will find they'll get lumps or knots where people are administering drugs, and it's not necessarily the drug itself, it's the person administering it. Earliest date the withdrawal time is met, and then, as I mentioned, any off-label use records and a copy of that prescription from your veterinarian. Chemical records. I spend a lot of time working with people on noxious weeds, and so this is very important that you know what you've applied to your ground. You'll want to keep a copy or know the name of the product name and the EPA number, how much pesticide you applied, where you applied it, the size of the area, the date of the application. If you hire it done by a licensed applicator, and some chemicals do require that you have an applicator's license, you want that number. And then probably most important for beef producers is, what are the grazing restrictions? And when are those restrictions met? If you read a label, there will be different grazing restrictions for beef cattle versus dairy cattle versus horse. And we have many herbicides on the market right now that are fantastic herbicides, and there's no grazing restrictions. But when you read the label, the herbicide will stay in the manure. And that becomes important to know and record, so that when the little lady down this road comes and wants manure for her garden, if you have utilized a product that the herbicide stays in the manure, you do not give that manure to her, or she's going to be very upset with you and not so neighborly next time it's around because you sent herbicide to her garden. So please read the label and pay attention to that. Veterinary Feed Directive. This has been on the books for a few years, but it's always good to take a look at it, and it's a work in progress. And to have a veterinary feed directory, you have to have a veterinary client-patient relationship, meaning you have a good working relationship with your vet. And these are for antibiotics and different drugs that can be applied directly to the feed. You can no longer go by and dump it in the water tank anymore. You have to have a prescription from your veterinarian or add it to the grain. And so you have to have that written statement from a veterinarian. There will be 2 dates on that statement from your vet. There will be the date of expiration, and that's the period of time a producer may utilize that feed. So you may be able to utilize it from January to June. And on June 30th, 2020, that would be the last date you could possibly use it. Then there will be the dates of duration of use, meaning the length of time that that animal can consume that specific feed. So while you may be able to use that feed between January 1 and June 30th, you can only feed it for 5 or 10 days at a time according to those directions. And so that's a duration of use. So as you look at those veterinary feed directives, what do you need to keep a record of? You want a copy of that VFD. You want to write down the group of animals you fed it to, whether it was the freshly weaned calves, it was the yearling heifers, it was the bulls. What dates did you actually put it in their feed? How much did you feed them? And why were you feeding them a medicated feed? What was that condition? Not that they looked sick, or what was the reason behind it? Remember, as you look at this, we're trying to explain the beef operation and what we do to people who don't always understand or have a background in beef. Many of, at least the Lemhi County producers, all have public lands grazing permits. And so those records are sometimes not always tracked very well, but it will do you as a producer good to keep those records, and your range con for that federal land management organization will be grateful if you have good records. So you just want to jot down, you know, when you move animals from pasture to pasture, where and when, and then how many did you move? Sometimes some of those bigger pastures, you may have to move, you may only get 10 animals today and another 20 tomorrow, but record that and which gate you put them through. Look at the status of those fence conditions and the repairs that need to be done. That way they know that you're working on things and you have an eye, and if cattle are coming back because the fence is down, then your range con knows what's happening.
Shannon?
Yes.
We have a question.
Okay.
Regarding photo monitoring and records or keeping for these types of records, there are several apps, and the creation of the apps exists an ArcGIS. Can you kind of talk about any of those type of record keepings?
Yes, I know that, so photo records, the important part is the photo itself. And there are some apps, and I've played with some of those apps depending on what we are wanting to accomplish. I don't have any specific recommendations for those. The higher quality the photo, the better off it is. And it's really nice if you can have them date and time stamped when you do take those photos. I know that Idaho Department of Agriculture right now is working with ArcGIS and some apps that if producers are working with Department of Ag on doing photo monitoring, that they'll provide those apps and that information for you to be able to utilize that, and then they go through and look at those photos and send them on to a Bureau of Land Management. I don't know if they have an MOU with the Forest Service yet, but there are a lot of apps, but photo quality is of utmost importance, so it's not grainy. Date, and then there are some simple data sheets about where you are. GPS location is the other thing that's critical to do that. And so I don't have a specific recommendation. A lot of the apps, I've played with some of the apps when I was working on a project, and my ranchers are economically conservative, so I was using a lot of free apps, and while they had lots of good information, they always didn't have the quality of photo that we needed. But with our newer cell phones, they have some good quality photos on those phones. So did that answer your question?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, super. So a lot of these that we're talking about right now go beyond the monitoring, and just simple notes that you can make, gates that are open or closed. This all shows your range con, that you're actively out there moving cattle, checking your range, doing your best to meet the requirements and the guidelines that when you met with them in the spring for what your grazing plan looked like, that you're doing your best to take and do that. And share this information with them, because then anybody ever questions what you're doing on your public lands grazing permit, they can say, yeah, I have record that he was out and moving cattle in these pastures for the last 4 days. So as you're gathering these records, and we'll talk about how to best to keep these records in a little bit, but communicate with your range conservationists about how do they want you to communicate with them. Do they want you to send them an email? Do they want you to send them a text? Do they want you to write something up? How do they want to know on an ongoing basis during the summertime and the grazing time what you're doing and why is going on? So work that out and talk with them. And then it, like I said, it shows that you're making an effort to follow that grazing plan and that your range conservationist has knowledge and proof of what's happening with your grazing permit at all times. And that way, if anything's ever questioned, they can better support you and be in your corner. Whoops. Okay. So here's a quiz time. You have some extra grass and purchased additional yearlings at the auction. You didn't get any vaccination records on them, so you give him the same injections you give all the others. Should you make a record? And we'll do a poll. Okay. That is not the question we needed. Maybe there we go. Okay. So I will launch this and you guys can vote if there should be a record or not. Okay. And everybody said yes. And so that is the correct answer. And so as you think about what these records are coming with these cattle, you don't know, you may or may not know where they came from originally, but you're updated on that vaccination record. You would pay attention to those withdrawal times, tag him, and then you would know if he did bring something in to your herd, which critter it came from. So now some methods to keep records. So there's all of these are across the board. You can do a calendar, computer program, notebook, red book, or other. So as you're choosing a system, the important thing about the whole thing is it has to work for your operation. And when you go back and try to look at that and you look at that data, you look at that information, it needs to be accurate and it needs to collect the necessary information. It really needs to fit into your operation. A commercial operation is going to be looking for different records and data versus what a registered operation is going to need. And so think about that. The information needs to be available to make informed decisions. It needs to be user-friendly, meaning you're willing to keep the data that way. And it does need to be written or electronic. That doesn't mean that you can write it on the dashboard of your pickup and call it written record, but it does need to be written down. So as you're getting started, animal identification is key. You want to make sure that you don't have a whole bunch of duplications and numbers of cattle, because then when you go back and try to figure out what's going on with cow 801 and you've got 3 of them, which cow 801 were you talking about? And so make sure there's no duplication of those numbers. set up a system for you with numbering your cattle that work for you. Some breed associations use a letter for the year that cow was born. Some of them use a number. Importantly, that you know the number, you know how it's set up, and you know that there's no duplicates. If you don't have all your cattle tagged or anything, and you're using a livestock marker or something, make sure that however you identify that animal that you treated, that it lasts longer than the withdrawal time is, so that it's not just 2 days till the next rainstorm comes by and washes that animal off. So calendars are great. We've all got calendars all over. They're free in December around around Christmas time, as everybody advertises. And there's nothing wrong with a good old wall calendar to write everything on. This is a copy that you can actually get off the National BQA site for treatment records. You can put it in a notebook. It's just got some good columns to write things in and write down the animal, the date, what you dated with, and can track it that way. You can do it by the animal, or we can do a whole group. My producers here in Lehigh County like the red books, and there are versions all over, red, green, depending on where your supplier is. And these are super, super handy. They have lots of treatment records in them, but they also have dates where you can write things down. If you do use the red book that ultimately comes from NCBA, you can go to the NCBA website under, I think, Cattlemen's College, or I'd have to look again, but you can actually download an Excel spreadsheet that matches up with the columns in your red books. And as you can see down here, across the bottom are all the separate pages in the red books, and you can put everything into Excel. And I love Excel. By doing some sorts and putting some formulas in, you can learn a lot about your cattle from Excel spreadsheets. This is one, if you process a lot of groups of cattle, you want to describe that cattle group, the date the product was administered, keep track of that route of administration, the serial number, withdrawal time in earliest dates. I like the envelopes. When you're spring work or fall work, you can tear the top of the box off from that vaccine that has the lot and serial number and the drug and everything, drop it in this envelope, fill out the information on the back, and drop it in your file cabinet or wherever you keep your records. Quick and easy way to do some group processing records. Don't forget about your cell phones. Your cell phones, we do not utilize them, at least I personally do not utilize them as much as you could when it comes to records. There's a note functions on there, and this is standard with most phones. And you can take and type some notes up on there, whether you're out looking at your range, fixing a gate, if you happen to doctor a cow or notice one that's got pink eye or is lame if you're in a wet pasture and has foot rot. You can put that in the notes function, and then you can email it or text it to somebody else so they know too. Cameras on there is great. A picture's worth 1,000 words. You can use this for your photo monitoring with your range conditions or of a downed gate, whatever you need to. That's a great thing. And then there's also the calendar function. You can go right into the day and add in that we move 50 head through this gate today, or this is the date we worked cattle, or this is the date withdrawal time will be met. So our cell phones are really, they're handy. Everybody carries them. I've had some ranchers that have not quite gone to iPhones and upgraded their phones, but then when they have grandkids, that gets upgraded real fast so they can get the pictures that they all have. So in summary, record keeping needs to become a regular habit. And it's really nice that if you finish working cattle and went in and sat down that night and got all the records together, reality, try to do it at least once a week and keep everything going. Choose a system that works for your operation. What works for you may not work for the neighbors down the road, or vice versa. Some records are required by law, withdrawal times, chemical application records. You need to be sure and utilize all of those. And then make sure the records you're keeping teach you and help you determine if you are reaching your operational goals. So obviously I've had a computer hiccup, so we'll just roll with this. So feed records, the date, if you buy feed, needs to be when you purchased and delivered it, the amount of feed you purchased, the lot and batch number, and then who delivered and who received it. And then this one needs to include any of your supplements, your salts, or anything in that direction. When you're looking at your own production records or feed you've raised there at home, how many days did you end up feeding a harvested feed? Which feeds to which group of livestock were you meeting those nutritional needs? And then if you had any feed analysis done on those feeds, keep a hold of those analysis, because that can tell you a lot about what your production is and if you're continuing to meet those needs of your cattle or if you need to renovate a field. Pasture records, how many grazing days did you get this year or last year? How's it compare? Fertilizer records are important, and track those where somebody can find them. I had an instance where the husband had passed away, the wife had been highly involved in the operation, but she called me and says, I know that Joe was good about getting soil tests, but did he happen to share which fields he was fertilizing when? And I says, I'm sorry, he didn't. So she was working at saving some money and trying to figure out which fields she needed a fertilizer. So those are important. And then irrigation records. When did the water turn on, turn off? Did you change from a flood to a center pivot or hand lines or wheel lines? So what your records look like that way. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen. I apologize for the mix-up in the slides. I've tried to do some new things with my presentations, and it didn't quite work today. But I hope that answered some of your questions. And so with that, if there's any other questions, I'll take them at this time.
Thank you for joining us today, for watching the recording later. And don't forget to join us again in 2 weeks on the 17th of June. We will have guest speakers Ben Eborn and Ashley Westerhold, who are both agriculture economists, and they're going to be covering some of the risk management components as well as some of the programs available out there to producers to safeguard themselves as we move into our grazing season. So thank you everyone for joining us. Please complete the survey, and thank you again, Shannon, for providing that wonderful information today.
You're welcome. Everybody have a nice day.